Disclaimer. This story contains mature themes intended for adult viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. The air was too quiet to be casual. Even the ticking clock on her kitchen wall sounded nervous, as if it knew I shouldn't still be there. I told myself I was just returning her book. That was the whole reason I knocked on her door in the first place. But somehow, I was still standing there, my shoes half off, the warmth of her home wrapping around me like something I couldn't step out of. She smiled. Not wide, just soft, careful, like she knew the effect it had. "You can leave it on the table," she said, her voice low enough that it brushed against the space between us. I nodded, pretending not to notice how close she'd stepped. The scent of her perfume, faint, familiar, and too personal, lingered in the air. The book slipped slightly from my fingers as I set it down. She reached out instinctively, her hand brushing mine for less than a second, but long enough to change the room's temperature. We both froze, her eyes flickering toward mine with a question neither of us spoke aloud. Outside, it had started to rain, soft, unhurried drops against the window pane. Inside, everything slowed down. Her breathing, my heartbeat, the way her fingertips lingered just a little too long on the edge of the book's cover. "You can stay until it stops," she said quietly. It wasn't an invitation. It was something between a thought and a confession. I hesitated. The distance between us could have been crossed in one careless step. Every sound, the rain, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint rustle of her sleeve, felt amplified. She turned slightly, her eyes catching the light, and for a moment, I wasn't sure which one of us had moved first. The book lay forgotten on the table. So did every excuse I'd rehearsed before knocking on her door. When she finally looked up again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You look like you could use a cup of coffee." I wanted to say no. I didn't. And as she walked toward the kitchen, the sound of her footsteps was the only thing I could focus on. Steady, deliberate, pulling me deeper into something I hadn't planned for. The rain wasn't stopping anytime soon. She handed me the mug, her fingers brushing mine just slightly longer than necessary. I caught myself staring, noticing the way her hand trembled a little, as if she were aware of the electricity in the air. I cleared my throat and took a sip, trying to ignore how warm the ceramic felt against my palms, how close she was standing, and how her eyes kept finding mine despite every attempt at casual conversation. The rain tapped rhythmically against the window, a soft counterpoint to the tension filling the kitchen. She leaned against the counter, her posture relaxed but deliberate, and I felt the weight of her presence pressing in. Every movement was measured, but something in the subtle tilt of her head or the quick glance over her shoulder made my pulse jump. "You've been reading a lot lately," she murmured almost to herself. Her lips curved faintly, and I noticed how small gestures, the brush of her hair behind her ear, the tilt of her chin, could carry more meaning than words ever could. I nodded, my throat suddenly dry, aware of how close we were and how easily a casual step could erase the space between us. I reached to adjust the mug in my hands, and our elbows bumped. She flinched slightly, but didn't pull away. Instead, her hand lingered near mine, a ghost of contact that neither of us fully acknowledged but that hummed with quiet energy. The silence stretched long enough that it became almost unbearable, the kind of silence that fills rooms when people are on the edge of saying something dangerous. I caught her watching me once, the corner of her lips twitching in a smile I couldn't interpret. I shifted slightly, trying to pretend it was just my knees stiffening from standing too long. She made a soft noise, almost a chuckle, and the sound made the air between us heavier, warmer. We moved around the kitchen in an unspoken rhythm, her reaching for a spoon, me adjusting the sugar, our hands passing close enough that it felt intentional. The room felt smaller somehow, tighter, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to witness the tension building silently, inch by inch. She whispered something I didn't catch, and I leaned closer, wanting to hear, but not wanting to seem too eager. Our breaths brushed. The space between us was shrinking, every glance carrying weight, every small touch promising more. And just as I thought I could step back, her eyes held mine in a way that made it clear. Something was about to cross the line, and neither of us could stop it. The air had grown thick, almost tangible, each breath drawn seeming to echo in the small space between us. I noticed the way she shifted slightly, just enough that her shoulder brushed against mine when she moved toward the counter, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to pull back, to remind myself this was only a visit, but my body betrayed me, drawn forward by something I couldn't name. Her eyes lingered on mine longer than necessary, holding a question in their depth that neither of us dared answer. I tried to focus on the mug I was holding, the warmth seeping into my hands, but it was impossible. Every glance, every flicker of her expression seemed charged, deliberate. I could feel the quiet pull of her presence, a gravity I hadn't expected, and for the first time I realized how easily one could get lost here. She moved around the room, small gestures that seemed mundane, brushing crumbs from the counter, adjusting a cushion on the chair, but every movement carried weight, almost like a silent conversation written in body language. Her hair fell over her shoulder, and she tucked it back, fingertips lingering a second longer than they needed to. I noticed the faint tremor in her hands, the quick inhale she took when I reached past her to grab the sugar. We circled each other, careful, hesitant, yet closer than anyone should be. The sound of the rain outside had faded into background hum, leaving only the quiet of our movements and the thrum of our own breathing. I could feel her awareness of me in every tilt of her head, every brush of her sleeve against my arm. It was like standing on a precipice, knowing the drop was near but unable to retreat. I didn't realize it would rain like this, she said softly, voice catching slightly. I leaned a little closer to hear, almost imperceptibly, and caught the warmth of her exhale. She didn't step back. Neither did I. Our hands brushed again, accidental or maybe not, and the spark it sent through me made the room feel smaller, the distance between us almost non-existent. Every glance, every whispered word, every pause seemed to heighten the tension, drawing us closer to a line neither dared cross. And as she leaned toward the window, peering at the rain, I realized we were both holding ourselves back, teetering on the edge of something neither of us could name, yet neither willing to step away. The moment hung between us, charged, fragile, and unbearably alive, leaving me wondering if we'd ever make it back to safety. The room seemed smaller now, the walls closing in, filled only with the sound of our breathing and the muted patter of rain outside. Every movement she made was sharper, more deliberate. A tilt of her head, a shift of her weight, a brush of her sleeve against the counter, and I felt it like a pulse through my chest. I wanted to step back, to remind myself of boundaries, but each instinct to retreat was overridden by a magnetism I couldn't resist. She reached for the sugar again, her hand just brushing mine as she passed. The contact was brief, but it lingered, a whisper of heat that refused to fade. Our eyes met immediately afterward, and she held my gaze longer than before, daring me to look away. I caught myself leaning forward without realizing it, drawn into the gravity of her presence. Her smile was subtle, almost teasing, a curve that held more than words could say. I noticed how the soft light fell across her face, highlighting the quiet strength in her eyes and the way her lips parted slightly as if she were holding something back. I wanted to ask, to speak, to close the space between us, but my voice felt heavy, and the air itself seemed too charged for words. She moved closer, rearranging the chairs by the table, and each step made the distance between us shrink imperceptibly. My pulse raced, my hands gripping the mug harder than necessary, and I could feel the tension vibrating through the room. The rain had slowed outside, but the atmosphere between us was thick, almost suffocating with anticipation. Her glance flicked toward mine, and there it was again. The unspoken question, the promise of something that hadn't happened yet but hovered on the edge of reality. Every accidental touch, every shared silence, felt amplified. It was as if the room itself was conspiring to draw us together, leaving no room for escape. I swallowed hard, aware of how close we had come, aware of the invisible line neither of us had dared cross. And yet the pull was undeniable. She reached for a book on the counter, fingers brushing mine once more. a brush that carried the weight of unspoken possibilities. My breath caught, my chest tightening, and I realized with a jolt that the next moment could change everything. And in that suspended heartbeat, with the storm outside giving way to quiet, it was clear. Something explosive was about to happen, and neither of us could turn back. The charged silence was shattered by a sudden knock on the door, sharp, insistent, and completely unexpected. My chest jumped, the sound cutting through the tension like lightning. She froze, her hand lingering on the counter as if mid-motion, and I felt the pull of adrenaline shoot straight through me. Neither of us moved immediately. It was as if acknowledging the sound would make it real, and neither of us was ready to face reality. Who could that be? I whispered, though my voice sounded louder in the thick air of the kitchen. Her lips pressed into a thin line, eyes narrowing slightly, a flicker of something unreadable passing over her expression. She didn't answer at once, and the silence stretched unbearably. Then, softly, almost reluctantly, she said, "It's probably just the neighbor downstairs, or maybe the mail." But the way she said it, voice tight, betrayed her calm exterior. I could feel the space between us contracting even further. Every instinct screamed for me to step back, to let the moment dissolve, but it was impossible. We were caught, suspended in a moment that had grown sharper, heavier, charged with a magnetism neither of us could deny. My hand itched to brush against hers again, to reach out, but the knock reminded me that the world existed outside this bubble, that someone could intrude at any second. The knocking came again, louder this time, and she moved toward the door, careful, deliberate, her movements a mix of grace and tension. My eyes followed her, heart hammering, the anticipation coiling tighter with each step she took. She opened the door just a crack, enough to peer out, and for a brief moment, I caught her profile framed by the dim hallway light. The air between us seemed to sizzle with unspoken words and unsaid confessions. A gust of wind from the hallway brought the faint smell of rain and something else, something mundane yet grounding, and it snapped me back to the present. Her eyes flicked to mine again. A question, a warning, a plea for restraint all rolled into one. I realized with a jolt that we were both trapped in our own desires, knowing that every glance, every subtle movement, was a step closer to a line neither of us was supposed to cross. Then the voice came from the other side of the door, casual, oblivious, and completely wrong. "Hey, did anyone see my umbrella?" The interruption was small, absurd even, but it was enough to pull reality into sharp focus. And yet, instead of dissipating the tension, it only made it worse. The charge in the room became almost unbearable. Our breaths quickened, eyes locking again, and every nerve in my body screamed that nothing could go back to normal once the door was closed. We stood there, frozen in the fragile space between restraint and surrender, aware that the world outside could intrude at any second, but that the gravity of this moment, the pull, the heat, the impossibility, was already too strong to ignore. And in that suspended heartbeat, it became clear. Whatever happened next would change everything, and neither of us could predict if it would be a risk worth taking. The door clicked shut behind her, cutting off the faint sound of the rain outside. The world narrowed to the small space between us, charged and unrelenting. Every step she took toward the counter felt deliberate, every subtle tilt of her head daring me closer. I could no longer pretend that this was just a visit. Something had shifted, and there was no going back. Her eyes met mine, steady and unflinching, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. The tension that had been coiling for hours finally unraveled, sending a jolt of adrenaline straight through me. I felt the warmth of her presence like a current, pulling me forward, closer than I'd ever been. Our hands brushed, this time neither accidental nor tentative, and the contact sparked a chain reaction I could no longer resist. "I shouldn't," I started, my voice trembling slightly, but she placed a finger over my lips before I could continue. "Shoo," she said softly, and the single word carried more weight than anything spoken before. Her eyes flickered, a storm of emotions I couldn't name, and I realized she was as trapped by the moment as I was. The world around us seemed to dissolve. The hum of the refrigerator, the muted patter of the rain, Even the ticking clock disappeared. All that existed was the pull, the gravity of proximity, the unspoken understanding that we had crossed into territory neither of us could deny. Words were unnecessary. Every glance, every subtle touch, every shared breath spoke volumes, conveying what had been building for hours. And then, just as the intensity reached its peak, a sudden sound cut through the charged air. A soft, almost imperceptible creak from the hallway. We froze, breaths caught in our throats. I realized with a jolt that we weren't alone. Her hand trembled slightly in mine, a reminder that reality was still lurking just outside our bubble. I stepped back instinctively, and so did she, the spell broken, leaving us both reeling. Yet even as the awareness returned, the residue of what had just passed between us lingered, thick and undeniable. Before either of us could speak, a note slid under the door. We exchanged a glance, her eyes wide with disbelief, mine with a mixture of shock and exhilaration. She picked it up, unfolding it slowly. The words written inside made the blood drain from my face. Asterisk, I know what happened, and I want in. Asterisk, everything changed in that instant. The boundary we'd thought was ours alone had vanished. And the story wasn't over yet. The rain had stopped, leaving the world outside washed clean and quiet. But the air inside still carried the weight of everything that had just unfolded. We stood in the kitchen, both of us catching our breath, the lingering tension settling into something warmer, more familiar. The room felt smaller, charged with a quiet intimacy that didn't need words to exist. She set the mug down, her fingers brushing mine one last time, gentle and fleeting. I smiled, a small, knowing gesture, and she returned it with that same soft curve of her lips that had kept me on edge all afternoon. We didn't need to speak. The silence was comfortable, the kind that comes after a storm, when everything is understood but nothing has been fully explained. I finally reached for my jacket, ready to leave, but she stopped me with a quiet word, not demanding, not commanding, simply reminding me that the door was open for more than just a goodbye. I lingered in the doorway, glancing back at her, aware of the subtle pull between us that hadn't faded, a promise still suspended in the space we shared. Thank you, I said softly, the words carrying more than gratitude. But she only smiled, a secretive, knowing expression that left me both satisfied and hungry for more. It was a moment of closure, yes, but also a reminder that some stories don't end neatly, that certain sparks linger long after the initial fire. I stepped outside, the cool evening air washing over me, yet I could still feel her presence behind me. A shadow, a warmth, an echo of everything that had passed. The note she had received, the mysterious interruption, hung in my mind, teasing, daring, hinting that the story was far from over. As I walked away, I realized that the hours I hadn't expected to spend in her home had changed something irreversibly. It wasn't just the closeness, the subtle touches, the stolen glances. It was the undeniable connection, the unspoken understanding that some bonds defy logic and timing, lingering long after distance separates them. And as the streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, I knew this wasn't just a memory I would carry. It was a spark, alive and insistent, a secret between two people who had discovered something that could never be fully explained but would never be forgotten.